Runners, stand behind your blocks, please. On your marks. Set.
You blathering old fool, Oosterhout. Why are you running aimlessly about in circles?
I can't very plausibly disavow my well-earned distinction as a blathering old fool, Crito, but I'm not running aimlessly about in circles.
You begin at the same effective place on the running track as you end. If you want to be at the finish line, you have only to remain at it. You needn't run the entire distance about the track in order to get back where you started, and you certainly needn't leap over 10 barriers en route. How is it that you are not running aimlessly about in circles?
I do not merely want to reach the finish line. I want to have the very special experience of running 400 meters and leaping over 10 hurdles in order to reach the finish line. I want to have the very special experience of running a standard flight of 400 meters intermediate hurdles. I value achieving the material end of the activity, that is to say, reaching the finish line, only if accomplished by means of running 400 meters and leaping over 10 hurdles. If you suppose that this is bizarre, Crito, effectively equivalent to running aimlessly about in circles, what do you make of the 10,000 meters track runner, who insists on running 25 times past the finish line in order to reach it?
I think it quite mad in both cases. No sane person, let us say in Florence and aiming only to be in Helsinki, prefers making the journey by way of Melbourne, if there is a more efficient and expedient route readily available to him. Nor would such a person prefer making the journey by means of walking, running, swimming, rowing, and or sailing if there are more efficient and expedient ways readily available to him.
That is of course so, but according to the prominent judgment of the most prominent judgment of the accomplished philosophical literature concerning sport, most notably the work of Professor Bernard Suits, sport does not resemble everyday activities in this basic respect. More nearly like the arts, sport is characteristically of the intrinsic realm, the realm of expression, the playful realm of ends in and for themselves. It is not characteristically of the extrinsic realm, the realm of necessity, the instrumental, work-like realm of means to other ends. The material means of sport and of the other inhabitants of the realm of expression, most notably mathematics, language, the natural and social sciences, the humanities, and the arts, are inherent in the material ends of these endeavors. Such means are necessary to these endeavors. They could not be substantively other than they are. They are thus both essential to and definitive of such endeavors, and they together form the basic character of these endeavors. The material means of the inhabitants of the realm of necessity, such as activities of the everyday, like commuting, truck driving, floor sweeping, house painting, piano moving, and typing, conversely, are not of necessity folded into these activities' material ends in order to form their basic character. The material means of such activities are consequently not necessary to them. They could well be other than they are. Such means are thus neither essential to nor definitive of such activities.
The material means of sport seem nonetheless different in another sense from the material means of other inhabitants of the realm of expression. They seem uniquely devoted to an inefficient realization of material ends.
That is largely the case. Sport explicitly prohibits the most efficient, expedient material means for achieving its material ends in favor of less efficient, expedient such means. The permissible means in sport are characteristically more limited than the possible means. In all other forms of human endeavor, with the arguable exception of several forms of artistic activity, the performing arts in particular, dance most significantly, the material means of achieving material ends are selected solely on the basis of their efficiency expediency, on the basis of their instrumental significance. In all activities other than sport, and several forms of artistic activity, it is considered trifling, that is, a violation of an activity's basic character, to choose less over more efficient expedient material means of proceeding. The material means of all activities other than sport, and several forms of artistic activity, are chosen and valued solely for their efficient and expedient contributions to achieving the material ends of such activities. They are not substantively valued apart from their contribution to achieving these ends. They are thus of extrinsic merit. In the case of sport, however, these means are not chosen and valued for their efficient and expedient contributions to achieving material ends. They and the ends they embody, and so the activity they define, are substantively valued in intrinsic, not in instrumental terms. Sport thus uniquely values both the material end, the final concrete act, the act of reaching the finish line in the case of the current example, and the material means of achieving this end, the act of running 400 meters and leaping over 10 barriers in the case of the current example. This end is not valued apart from the very special means by which it is permissibly achieved. The defining rules of sport are consequently accepted just because an acceptance makes possible an inherently compelling, fulfilling, playful, and self-consciously intrinsic experience, an expressive experience, a distinctly human experience. There is no other plausible internal interpretation that accounts for the appeal of such otherwise useless phenomena, meaning there is no other plausible interpretation that explains sport's characteristic choice of less over more efficient expedient material means of achieving its material ends.
You claim that the principal aim in this madness is, or ought to be, expressive, but don't many, likely most, engage in sport mainly for instrumental reasons, for reasons having primarily to do with biological or medical objectives as a form of exercise, or for reasons grounded in such as catharsis, character enhancement, acculturation, education, recreation, military preparation, entertainment, commercial and financial gain, popular acclaim, and nationalistic aggrandizement.
They very much do, but such engagements are not in primary accord with sport's definitive nature and purpose. Such engagements are instead governed by aims and dispositions incidental to sport as such. Sport would be what it is irrespective of its service to biological, psychosocial, military, commercial, or political goals. An authentic engagement in sport entails a primary regard for its defining characteristics, principally for its playful characteristics and their expressive consequences.
How then do you assess the status and prevalence of other than expressive engagements in sport?
I'm not arguing that other than expressive engagements are entirely without consequence or merit. I eagerly acknowledge that an authentic engagement in sport may well and laudably include some of them, but only as subordinate aspirations. In an authentic engagement in sport, it is the expressive dimension that drives the other than expressive, not the other way about. The appeal sport has in the realm of necessity is thereby a function of its basically expressive qualities. Even those of us who primarily aspire to the expressive dimension of sport, meaning to fulfilling the defining character, the intrinsic character of sport, are pleased that sport often has salutary, albeit ancillary, utility in the realm of necessity. The realm of necessity, however, crafts and values its means and ends very differently than sport, crafts and values itself very differently than sport, and is unable to account for sport's basically playful nature, for sport's expressive significance, for sport's willing choice of less over more efficient means of achieving its ends. If sport were fundamentally instrumental, meaning of the realm of necessity, it would characteristically aim at a very much more opportune, a very much more efficient fashioning of result than it does.
You have thus far apparently argued that the inherently playful quality of sport is its principal defining quality. Are there others?
I am arguing, as you have suspected, Crito, that sport is primarily defined by its inherently playful property. I want also to argue that it is this property that frames the character of sport's other two defining properties, the property of competition and the property of physicality. Prominent aspects of the accomplished philosophical literature concerning sport sometimes refers to the property of play as the first internal criterion of sport, to the property of competition as the second internal criterion of sport, and to the property of physicality as the third internal criterion of sport.
What is meant by the criterion of competition in this context?
According to prominent aspects of the accomplished philosophical literature concerning sport, most notably the work of Professor Scott Kretschmer, sport is inherently competitive in the sense that its defining rules constrain us to achieve challenging levels of performance. These levels are variously determined by the performance of worthy opponents, as in the case of Emil Zatopek attempting to surpass Vladimir Kuts in 5,000 meters running, and or by stipulated conventions of performance, as in the case of attempting to throw the hammer beyond 80 meters. By the playful form of this argument, it is a characteristic feature of sport to attempt to achieve victory over an elusively high standard, the ultimate significance of which is to gain a searching sense of ourselves at our utmost, a searching sense of excellence. We are consequently obliged in sport to give every measure of ourselves in pursuit of victory fairly and honestly gained, and in pursuit of a sense of excellence that fervent striving entails. In accord with sport's inherently playful character, the competitive property of sport frames the opposition presupposed by it in cooperative terms. That is, in terms by which the primary competitive aim of sport is excellence, a subjective sentiment. The principal secondary such aim concerns winning-losing, or gaining victory, evading defeat, an objective entity. Also in accord with sport's inherently playful character, the foremost competitive rewards of sport, that is, senses of excellence, are mutually inclusive. That is to say, these rewards are shared by all participants, albeit not altogether equally. Opponents by this view are thus conceived as joint facilitators, as esteemed colleagues, as human beings like ourselves, as fellow athletes who merit the same intrinsic respect that we withhold for ourselves. They assist us in our earnest pursuit of excellence, we assist them in theirs. They constrain us, and we them, to perform at our and their utmost.
And what is meant by the third internal criterion of sport, the criterion of physicality in this context?
According to prominent aspects of the accomplished philosophical literature concerning sport, most notably the work of Professor Robert Paddock, the criterion of physicality is a reference to the physical movements that constitute sport's definitive medium. Like play and competition, these movements are inherent to the activity and characteristic of it. These movements embody and convey sport's expressive as well as its other possibilities. In respect to medium, sport, not unlike the arts, is devoted to a unique search for the fundamental ground of one of life's central precincts. In the case of sport, for the fundamental ground of physical or bodily movement. Sport is inherently physical in the sense that its defining rules manifest a characteristic emphasis on the physical, an emphasis which makes the manner in which movements are performed consequential in a definitive, in a defining sense. The significance of sporting movements is not therefore exhausted by these movements' material results. Sport's respect for movement is more fundamental than a mere regard for the tangible consequences of movement. This respect is deeper than a mere regard for transporting sport persons and their implements from a place to another. This is the case because such movements transport in a very special way, in another than most efficient way, and they do this just because such a way makes the movements themselves possible. These movements are what they are just because we find them edifying. They are otherwise without definitive standing. There is no other plausible internal interpretation, which accounts for sport's profoundly deferential regard for its definitive medium, which accounts for the charms of such otherwise useless phenomena. Sport would entail notably more efficient movements than it does, and it would not canonize these movements as respectfully as it does if this were not the case. Unlike any other form of human activity, with the arguable exception of dance, then the physical movements of sport establish the novel and profound place of sport in human experience. They form the definitive medium of the activity, somewhat as organized sound forms the definitive medium of music.
How, then, does sport's regard for bodily movement differ from the regard accorded it by other forms of human activity, most notably from the regard accorded it by the activities of every day, by exercise, and by board and card games?
The movements requisite to all forms of human activity other than sport, and several forms of artistic activity, are extrinsic to such activities, meaning they are significant to such activities only insofar as they achieve the material ends of such activities, that is, only insofar as they effectually transport entities from a place to another. The significance of movements in all forms of human activity other than sport and several forms of artistic activity is altogether consumed by their results, by the state or position moved from and to. In these other forms of activity, the primary concern with respect to medium is not therefore with the movements themselves, but with their efficient consequences. The primary concern is not in the intrinsically compelling and aesthetically relevant possibilities of the movements themselves. The movements entailed by these other activities are thus valued primarily as expedient means. The activities of every day are an obvious instance of such activities. Exercise and board games are more problematic cases. In exercise, particularly as it pertains to sport, physical movements are performed primarily for the purpose of maintaining or enhancing the structural and functional disposition of the self in such terms as speed, strength, stamina, flexibility, and agility. That is, in terms that may be useful to sporting performance. The significance of physical movements in exercise is thereby exhausted by the results of such movements, as in the case of everyday activities. In such as chess, as an exemplar of board and card games, as well as all other forms of human activity other than sport and the performing arts, there is likewise no definitive significance in the movement gestures by which pieces are transported from a position on the playing board to another. The pieces may be moved by any reasonable means. These means, as such, do not thus constitute a definitive feature of the activity. The entire significance of such movements is spent in the positions from and to which various pieces on the playing board are moved. In such as marathon running, as an exemplar of sport and the performing arts, conversely, there is every definitive significance in the movement gestures by which one gets from start to finish line. One must run, one must pass over a stipulated course and distance, and one must avoid taking up courses of run commanded by other runners. Only in sport and the performing arts are the movements as such canonized, that is, are the movements made the primary, the governing issue in respect to medium.
You have evidently concluded, on the basis of these several arguments, that sport constitutes an inherently engaging and, in and for itself, a fundamental form of human fulfillment and expression, that human beings find sport edifying on its own terms, and that sport fulfills among our most basic inclinations as rational and aesthetic beings, as uniquely and distinctly human beings. You have evidently also concluded, on the basis of these several arguments, that sport is inherently stirred by the pursuit of excellence, and that sport defines its distinctive medium in inherently physical terms.
That is the claim, Crito, and it is a claim which likewise surmises that sport shares the basic outline of these three qualities with the other fundamental forms of human expression, most notably with the arts, which also characteristically embody the intrinsic narrative, embrace the pursuit of excellence, and substantiate a distinctive medium, meaning an essential aspect of human experience. Also contributing to this assertion are the terms in which sport shares the formal outlines of its originative and developmental history with the other fundamental forms of human expression, with the arts in particular. That is to say, sport and these other forms first appear in the human record in the same approximate period, namely in the late Paleolithic age. They first occur under the same approximate conditions, namely the preconditions of leisure and leisure itself. They first take the same forms, namely imitative forms. They then develop in similar representative forms and later still in similar expressive forms, and they occupy a ubiquitous place in the historical record of human experience. These archetypal forms of human expression, including sport, are everywhere present in distinctly human instances of cultural historical life. They have been deeply woven into the fabric of virtually every human culture and epoch, from ancient primitive society to our own. Only exceedingly rare cultures, so termed cultures, cultures deficient in a sense of the intrinsic, and so also in a sense of the uniquely human, have failed to develop an affection for sport and the other defining marks of human life. Sport, not unlike these others, thus constitutes a universal and everywhere present, as well as a fundamental, a defining form of human practice.
The sport you characterize as inherently playful, competitive in the cooperative sense, and physical in the intrinsic sense does not much resemble the sport of contemporary culture, or, for that matter, the sport chiefly practiced throughout the ancient, medieval, and modern worlds. How do you reconcile your claim of sport's basically playful nature and purpose with a historical record that little recognizes this claim?
With uneasy pause, it is regrettably so that sport has been primarily devoted throughout the virtual whole of its history to instrumental aims. That sport has been primarily devoted to a narrow, adversarial, and strictly partisan form of competition, and that sport has typically interpreted its medium in thin, extrinsic terms. Sport has been principally devoted throughout its formal record to the production, distribution, and consumption of commodities, power, wealth, fame, and privilege, mainly in biological terms, in the service of exercise and medicine, in psychosocial terms, in the service of catharsis, character enhancement, acculturation, education, and recreation, in commercial terms, in the service of entertainment, popular acclaim, and financial gain, in military terms, in the service of preparation for war, and in political terms, in the service of nationalism and patriotism. The overwhelming sweep of sports development has thus emphasized the variously serviceable uses to which it may be and has been put. Only in the Panhellenic athletic festivals of classical Greece and in the modern Olympic Games of 19th and 20th century Europe has sport comported itself in main accord with its inherently playful nature and purpose, and even these cases were more so hoped-for prospects than matters of fully attained fact. Sport has thus had a disquietingly spare record as a form of human illumination, decency, and fulfillment.
Sport has thus failed almost entirely throughout its record in human affairs to function in main accord with its inherent nature and purpose, and it has therefore likewise failed almost entirely to function as a distinctly human form of expression. What is the significance of this in your view?
The hold of instrumental values on sport has been near to complete. This is a development that is nonetheless obscured and soiled, not illumined and elevated, sport's intrinsically human, its fundamentally playful nature and purpose. The principal result of the instrumental tendency is that sport gets its back turned to itself. It gets cut off from its own defining character and purpose. It is unable to secure a viable relation with the central fabric of genuine human experience. It is alienated from its humanizing possibilities, and it cannot consequently function within the intrinsic richness of authentic human experience. Sport is thereby estranged from the governing character and significance of human life, and humanity lives as though broken into disaffected parts. Under the dominant influence of instrumental terms, sport cannot but cultivate the germ of its own destruction and wither away as a worthy form of distinctly human endeavor.
That is a damning assessment which does not seem to square with the extensive contemporary acclaim of sport.
It is so that sport most Emphatically, sport of the instrumental variety has at no prior time been more widely practiced or acclaimed than it has been in contemporary culture, the culture of the past approximate 2 centuries. The instrumental excesses and deficiencies of contemporary life have nonetheless made sport some plastic thing done for predominantly extrinsic purposes, and have made athletes some plastic things that secure such purposes. These excesses and deficiencies have made sport little other than a stylish and thoughtless doing of things, or a mere means of doing more important things. These excesses and deficiencies have concealed and misrepresented the inherently enriching character of sport as such. The status of sport is a compelling end in and for itself. The status of sport is a fulfilling form of distinctly and authentically human experience.
You have earlier implied that there are some instrumental uses of sport that are not opposed to the primarily expressive character of the activity, uses that are effectively compatible with sport's inherently expressive character. You now seem to be arguing that instrumental uses of sport violate sport's inherently playful character. How do you reconcile these various claims?
Biological and psychosocial employments of sport, while not fundamentally expressive themselves, are nonetheless consonant with expressive aims. They are effectively on the way to expressive aims. Commercial, military, and political employments, conversely, explicitly disrupt expressive possibilities. Principal among the many instrumental stewards of sport's contemporary morass is its pernicious embrace of the entertainment motif. Sport has increasingly taken the form of jejune entertainments and has thus embraced the tendency of such entertainments to insipid, frivolous, pompous, and unreflective distortion of the central precincts of human existence. Under the influence of this tendency, such entertainments divert from the elegant nuances of these precincts. As this and other similar instrumental themes have deepened in sport, so too is more openly and uncompromisingly disrespectful, conceited, narcissistic, and contentious demeanor among and between spectators, officials, coaches, and athletes. As this and other similar instrumental themes have deepened in sport, so too is a notable and conspicuous decline in regard for the principles, the expectations, and the elevations of sportsmanship, of fair play, of the well-played game, of the classical ideal of the scholar-athlete, and of the virtues of worthy opponents. As this and other similar instrumental themes have deepened in sport, so too has a notable and conspicuous decline in regard for unentertaining rein, insight, and decency. And as this and other similar instrumental themes have deepened in sport, so too has a notable and conspicuous decline in preference for humble and respectful bearing over grotesque buffoonery, boorish charisma, and arrogant displays of inane behavior, fashion, and proclamation. The result of all of this, sport as a form of profane entertainment, has corrupted and dishonored both sport and humanity.
Are there yet other prominent and hapless consequences of the instrumental influence on sport that warrant comment in your judgment?
Adverse manifestations of this influence are legion. The realms of necessity and expression are conflated in ways that confuse and diminish both. The realm of necessity relinquishes its requisite gravity and is wrongly made to appear shallow. The realm of expression relinquishes its governing charms and is wrongly made to appear trivial. The rankest forms of partisanship, forms that do not only not redeem everyone and everything, but blatantly condemn many, if not most, are expressly, shamelessly, and enthusiastically promoted. The significance of sport's adversarial, factious, hierarchical, and exclusionary tendencies is vastly overstated, thereby miscasting the competitive quality of sport and also failing to adequately acknowledge its two other definitive qualities, most tellingly its playful quality. The ardently commended association of sport with commercial, military, and political projects and dispositions has deepened mercenary and xenophobic excesses by which brands, corporations, schools, regions, and nations dogmatically and often violently declare their superiority over so termed lesser entities, excesses by which the discord among the various peoples of the world is inflamed, excesses by which even the most innocuous and fecund forms of sport, such as pedagogical and youth sport, are commodified and debased, and excesses by which even the most credible and compelling forms of sporting expression, such as the Olympic Games, are transformed into vapid spectacles.
Is it fair to claim that these adverse manifestations have also come to include an alarming disrespect for the rules of sport?
It very much is. According to the playful interpretation of sport, we are morally obliged to abide by the rules of sport, not as a merely formal constraint or as a mere way of evading penalties and, of course, the disadvantages customarily associated with penalties, but out of a genuine respect for them, for the activity they define, that is to say, for sport itself, for sports persons, for our collective humanity, and for ourselves. Intentional violations of the rules of sport constitute violations of the basic nature and purpose of sport, and they are also tantamount to open and egregious affronts to human decency. Such violations treat the rules of sport in strictly legalistic and begrudging ways, that is, in ways which are not authentically consistent with moral imperatives. The result of this is that the rules of sport are stretched to their strict limits. They are pushed to the edge of any fair interpretation of them and beyond, if evading detection is probable. This in order to gain the sort of partisan advantage and instrumental reward most sought. Rules are thereby intentionally, routinely, and brazenly violated if such behavior is likely to bring this sort of advantage and harvest. It is thus widely considered permissible, even advisable, in some instances laudable, to use prohibited ergogenic aids, to feign injuries, to bait and berate officials and opponents, to solicit official errors, to inventively commit fouls in ways that intend to evade detection, to solicit spectator acclaim for oneself or spectator disruption of an opponent, to feign or court errors of an opponent, to play with the intent to inflict injury, to artificially inflate or deflate winning-losing margins, to posture in grotesque, psychotic, arrogant, intimidating, raging, or wrathful ways, and to accept penalties and other adverse results, not with equanimity, but with resentful hostility.
What is to be done about all of this, in your view?
It is only with the taming of civil society's fiercely instrumental orientation that our world, our culture, and our sport can be made tolerably human, that we may be made over into what we are at our utmost, that we may come to our most edifying possibilities, that we may bring ourselves to fulfillment. We shall have decent forms of sport when we have a decent world. It is only in such a context that sport is enhanced by what is most basically human, and that humanity is itself fortified by its sporting expressions. It is only in such a context that sport can meet the test of authentic humanity, be considered an active search for authentic humanity, and serve the broadest human purposes. It is only in such a context that sport overcomes the fashionable claims against it as an unreflective diversion devoted to securing strictly instrumental aims, that sport lives in full continuity and accord with the whole of distinctly human existence, that sport is worthily included in any studied interpretation of a fully human existence, and that sport takes its rightful place among the essential disciplines of academic life and among the essential expressions of the human condition. The vitality of human life is such, and of human life's sporting attributes necessarily depend, on such a reformulation.
What have you most hoped to achieve with this commentary?
My principal intention has been to leave a concise philosophical and aesthetic impression of sport's fundamental nature and purpose, of what sport is fundamentally about, of what it is fundamentally for, and of what is ultimately possible in sport, to reveal the basic place of sport in human life, and to incite consideration for reform of sport's untoward tendencies. Compactly said, I have most hoped to at least provoke the thought that sport occupies a deeper and a more significant station in the human ambit than commonly acknowledged, effectively to demonstrate that sport is a great deal more compelling than the metaphor of running aimlessly about in circles implies.
Have you succeeded in any of this, do you suppose?
That is for others to judge, of course. I am at least clear that, as in sport itself, there can be no credible expectation of success without earnest effort. Please excuse me now, if you would, Crito. I have yet other useless preoccupations to consider before exhaustion and nightfall have their way with us.